Sometimes I wonder if I'm broken, or just the only one who's finally honest about how fake it all feels. I used to force myself into conversations that felt like cardboard. Smile on cue, nod at the right places, learn the script, repeat it. I thought I was being social, but I was just being agreeable. Because no one told me that some of us aren't meant to blend in, we're meant to see through. It usually starts quietly, not with a breakdown or some dramatic fall from grace, but with an ache, a kind of internal hum that says, this isn't it. These people, these conversations, this noise, this version of me. And if you don't silence it, if you let that hum grow louder, it eventually becomes unbearable to keep playing the game. You start ghosting events, letting texts rot, watching the phone ring and not caring who it is. People call it burnout, they call it antisocial, they call it depression. But what if it's none of those things? What if it's not collapse? What if it's clarity? You're not pulling away from people because you're broken. You're pulling away because you're starting to see them and yourself with a kind of painful honesty that doesn't let you pretend anymore. Arthur Schopenhauer saw it. He once wrote, "The more unintelligent a man is, the less mysterious existence seems to him." Translation: if you can live comfortably in surface-level distraction, it's probably because you've never really touched the depth of what it means to be human. And once you do touch it, once you realize how much of modern life is built on pretending, posturing, and pleasing, you don't want to be around it. You're not antisocial. You're allergic to performance. For a while, you still try. You smile. You nod. You laugh at the jokes. You go to the dinner. But halfway through a conversation, you catch yourself staring into space, thinking, none of this is real. Not because you don't care, but because the mask you're wearing to survive that room is suffocating. And you realize you'd rather be alone in the truth than surrounded by people in a lie. This is the beginning of unbecoming, not healing, not fixing, but unraveling, letting go of the self you stitched together just to belong somewhere you were never meant to stay. And here's the first brutal truth. Most people don't want a connection. They want relief. Relief from their loneliness. Relief from their silence. Relief from their own mind. So they fill their calendars. They chase validation. They confuse attention with intimacy. And when you stop playing along, they get uncomfortable. Because you become a mirror they didn't ask to look into. You say, I just need some space. They hear, you're not enough. But this isn't about them. It's about you. And the sacred pull of your own mind saying, come home. Come home to the parts of yourself you abandoned in rooms where depth was unwelcome. Come home to the conversations you've been dying to have but can't force on people who only speak in highlights and hashtags. Come home to the truth that being alone doesn't mean you're lacking. It might mean you're finally full. The unraveling doesn't happen all at once. It's not cinematic, it's not beautiful, it's subtle, gradual, almost boring. At first you say no to one thing, a party, a group hang, a happy hour. You tell yourself it's just for tonight. You're tired, you need to recharge. But then next week comes, and the idea of small talk feels unbearable. The laughter sounds rehearsed. The questions feel like transactions. What do you do? Been busy lately. You start to see the script behind the smiles, and once you see it, you can't unsee it. So you pull back, not out of malice, not even out of fear, but because your inner world starts asking questions the outer world refuses to answer. Why does no one ever say what they actually mean? Why does silence feel more nourishing than most conversations? Why do I feel lonelier surrounded by people than I do when I'm completely alone? This is the withdrawal, not from life, but from illusion. Schopenhauer believed that social life was often a performance of connection without the substance. He saw it not as evil, but as exhausting. Most people don't seek truth in others. They seek validation. And once you no longer need that validation, something strange happens. You disappear. Not physically, emotionally, energetically. You stop feeding the machine. You stop curating your presence. You stop pretending that what bores you still excites you. This isn't depression. This isn't coldness. This is clarity beginning to take shape. You realize that many relationships were built not on depth or truth, but on convenience, on shared environments, shared schedules, shared coping mechanisms. Take away the proximity, and the bond dissolves. You start to notice who reaches out when you stop initiating. You notice how much of your presence was maintenance, and it stings, because some of the people you loved most didn't love you back. They loved the version of you who showed up and made things easier. The version who nodded along, who laughed at jokes that didn't land, who asked questions no one ever asked you in return. When that version fades, so do they, and you're left in the quiet, where everything hurts, but nothing lies. This is the pattern, the shedding, the solitude that doesn't ask for your permission. It claims you, and somewhere in that space, something ancient stirs, a voice that says, "This is who you were before you learned how to be liked." This is the stage where people misunderstand you most. You cancel plans and they think you're rude. You're quiet at gatherings and they think you're judging. You say no and they think you're arrogant. But you're not any of those things. You're just done pretending. Here's what no one tells you about solitude. At first it feels like emptiness, a blank room, a hollow ache, silence that stretches too long. But stay there long enough, and something begins to whisper. Not your ego, not your inner critic, not even your mind, but something older, something quieter. It doesn't speak in words, it speaks in remembering. You start to recall versions of yourself that were buried beneath the noise. The child who could sit in a room for hours and daydream. The teenager who questioned things that made adults uncomfortable. The parts of you that always knew truth was something you felt, not just something you were taught. This is the awakening of the inner world. Not an escape, but a return. You begin to create, not for applause, but for expression. You write things and don't post them. You dance alone in your apartment at 1 a.m. You go on walks without headphones just to hear your thoughts without interference. And those thoughts, they change. They soften. They deepen. They begin to speak to you like an old friend, because you're finally listening. Schopenhauer saw this as essential, not optional, for anyone who truly wants to understand the nature of reality, to observe without distortion, to feel without distraction, to think without interference. He believed solitude wasn't isolation, it was integration. The pulling back of all your fragmented selves into something whole. Because when you're always around others, you unconsciously fracture yourself. You adapt, you censor, you perform. But alone, you exist, raw, unfiltered, real, and in that rawness, something powerful begins to take root, sovereignty. You no longer need the world to reflect you back to yourself. You no longer crave the cheap high of likes, mentions, or casual flattery. You begin to enjoy the space between things, between thoughts, between interactions, between breaths. The world becomes less of a stage and more of a canvas. And suddenly, you don't feel empty. You feel full, because now you're not feeding off others. You're feeding from within. You begin to understand why monks go silent, why philosophers write in seclusion, why artists disappear before their best work appears. It's not because they're rejecting life, it's because they're finally meeting it without filters. This is the sacred shift from social survival to spiritual clarity, from distraction to discernment. And when that inner world awakens, you no longer ask, "What should I say to be liked?" You ask, "What is true enough to say, even if no one claps?" This is how you begin to reclaim your life. Not in loud declarations, but in quiet decisions. Decisions like, "No, I won't go." "Yes, I'll stay in tonight." "No, I don't need to explain myself." You realize Your peace is not up for negotiation. Your presence is not a public utility. Your truth is not a group project. You were never meant to be on all the time. You were meant to be, and now you are. Clarity doesn't come cheap. No one tells you that. You imagine that waking up will feel like light pouring through the cracks, that you'll feel free, relieved, whole. But the truth, it's heavier than that. Awakening begins as a kind of death, the death of illusions, the death of roles you used to play, the death of comfort in places that once felt like home. And when that happens, you grieve. You grieve friendships that can't hold your truth. You grieve the old version of you who tried so hard to fit in. You grieve the realization that love, for many, was conditional on your conformity. Schopenhauer didn't sugarcoat this. He believed that to see clearly is to suffer deeply, because the world is not kind to those who stop pretending. Once you stop performing, you lose the applause. Once you stop agreeing, you lose the approval. Once you stop showing up as the version of you others are used to, you lose people. And some of them you'll miss. You'll sit in your room some nights and remember how easy it was to not think so much. How easy it was to just go along with the group. To laugh even when nothing was funny. To say yes when your whole body said no. There's a strange nostalgia for the mask, because it gave you access. Access to rooms you no longer belong in. Access to people you no longer trust. Access to comfort you can no longer fake. And now, you're left with the silence, sometimes sacred, sometimes suffocating, because being awake in a sleeping world is a kind of exile. You see too much. You feel too deeply. You question things others accept without blinking. You become difficult, too intense, too sensitive, too serious. But that's not the truth. The truth is, you're inconvenient, because you can't unsee what you've seen, and you won't play along just to be liked. And that's terrifying to people who need your compliance to feel comfortable. So they ghost, or criticize, or say you've changed. And they're right. You have. You've started listening to your gut instead of groupthink. You've started asking better questions. You've started saying no without guilt. And yes, it costs you. It costs you connection. It costs you certainty. It costs you the belonging you never really had, but still clung to like a child gripping a broken toy. But here's the twist. Everything you lose, you gain in a different form. You lose shallow approval, but gain self-respect. You lose performance-based friendships, but gain inner quiet. You lose comfort, but gain truth. And truth, unlike comfort, doesn't fluctuate. It anchors you, even when you're crying, even when you're misunderstood, even when you're lonely. Schopenhauer called this loneliness inevitable for those who pursue wisdom, because the deeper your understanding, the fewer people you can speak to without translating yourself. But he didn't view it as tragedy. He saw it as necessity, because to know yourself is to stop fearing solitude, to require it. And slowly that solitude becomes sacred, not because it's easy, but because it's true. Not everyone stays in solitude forever, but those who return, they come back different, not louder, not shinier, not more palatable to the crowd. They return like a storm that has learned to whisper. Before, you needed company to feel real. Now you walk into a room and say nothing and still carry presence, because silence isn't your absence anymore, it's your essence. This is the paradox Schopenhauer hinted at but never spelled out. That true power doesn't look like dominance. It looks like sovereignty, the kind of energy that doesn't beg to be seen, because it sees itself. You've returned to the world, but not to belong to it, to influence it, not to win its approval, to embody your truth in full, and that's unsettling. People notice something different. They can't explain it, but they feel it. You no longer laugh to fill silence. You no longer smile to be accepted. You no longer explain yourself to be understood. There is a calmness in you now that cannot be shaken, because it was earned, in fire, in quiet, in exile. You realize You don't need to raise your voice. You are the voice, not because you're better, but because you're finally aligned with your values, with your boundaries, with your soul. This kind of alignment is magnetic, not because it draws everyone in, but because it repels the unnecessary. And what remains is real and rare. You're no longer addicted to relevance. You're devoted to resonance. So you speak slower now. You choose your words, not to perform, but to pierce. You don't rush to fill space. You honor it. You don't show up everywhere. You show up when it matters. This is what happens when solitude finishes its work. You return as a presence, not a person. As a mirror, not a mask. You enter a room and change its temperature, not by force but by frequency. You are no longer seeking the world's permission to be. You are, fully, unapologetically, undeniably. This is the return, not to who you were, but to who you've always been, underneath it all. And now, you finally understand. The silence wasn't empty. It was pregnant, with power, with clarity, with you. So here you are, not at the end of a journey, but at the beginning of a very different one. Not the path of becoming, but the path of unbecoming. All the noise has faded, the applause has stopped, the mirrors have shattered, and in the aftermath, something has emerged. Something unmistakable. You, not the version they shaped, not the mask you wore to survive, not the product of your past, but the presence beneath it all. And now, with nothing left to prove, you finally understand. You never needed to be understood by everyone. You only needed to be known by yourself. That's the final realization. Solitude wasn't isolation. It was recognition of who you are when no one's watching, of what you value when no one's clapping, of what you believe when no one's preaching. All this time you thought you were lonely, but you were being reintroduced to the only relationship that ever truly mattered, the one between you and your soul. And here's the secret. Once you make peace there, within, you become untouchable, not in a hardened way, not in a distant way, but in a grounded, luminous, still way. Because now, your validation doesn't come from being seen. It comes from seeing, clearly, quietly, completely, and the world will still misunderstand you. That doesn't change. But you'll stop needing to explain yourself to people committed to misunderstanding. You'll stop auditioning for connection that requires you to shrink. You'll stop trying to fit into spaces that demand your noise and reject your depth. Because now you know, presence is power, solitude is strength, and clarity is freedom. So when they ask, why don't you come around anymore? You won't need to defend yourself, you'll just smile, not out of arrogance, but out of peace. Because you know what they don't, that your absence isn't emptiness, it's elevation. And from up here, you finally see it all clearly. You're not antisocial, you're not broken, you're not hiding, you're awake. And this life you're building in the silence, it may not be loud, it may not be seen, it may never trend, but it is yours. And that is everything.